Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Friday. I want us to look again at the warnings that Jude has given us in his little epistle in the end of the Bible, where he says these false teachers or those who have turned away from God only pretend to be believers, and it's so dangerous. He describes them in two ways in verse 13. They are like raging waves of the sea, foaming up their own shame, wandering stars for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. Now, I am not a huge fan of the beach and the waves along the shore. I do enjoy a nice peaceful ocean view and maybe some small waves lapping at the sand. But man, when the storm comes and the waves rage, they can be so destructive. Notice one of the descriptions of these apostates is they are like raging waves of the sea. I think this group is seen as boasting with pride and arrogant speech. Somewhat like he says in verse 16, their mouth speaketh swelling words. Have you ever walked down the beach after a great storm? And you see all the ugly debris that has been washed up there by those swelling waves. That's the kind of disaster that these people bring in the church. Perhaps Jude is referring to God's word where he says in Isaiah 57:20, but the wicked are like the troubled sea when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. There is no peace, says my God, for the wicked. Well, they may make a great storm and foam, but their words are just empty, and so are their hearts. Secondly, he pictures these apostates as wandering stars. You know, we know there are certain stars in the night sky that can be used by navigators. Perhaps they point their compass to the North Star and depend on it being true in its place in order to navigate them in the darkness, perhaps out in the great seas with no other landmarks. But these people are not like those kind of stars. You cannot place your trust in these apostates who have turned away from God. They are more like meteors, he says, those falling stars that pass quickly through the sky and then they vanish because they are burned up in the atmosphere. Many have lost their bearing. They have departed from the faith because they have placed their faith in those people who, much like the wandering stars, have not been faithful. Can you imagine what a catastrophe our lives would be if we were depending on one of these false teachers who has turned away from God? He says he's reserved the fallen angels in everlasting chains for darkness. But in this passage, but for those who once followed the Lord and perhaps even gathered disciples to follow them and then turned away, he has reserved the blackness of darkness forever. Is that not a frightening picture? In Matthew chapter 8, Jesus marvels at the faith of a Roman centurion, and he says, this is greater than the faith that I've seen in Israel, because many children of the kingdom shall be cast into outer darkness, where there'll be wailing and gnashing of teeth, because they did not believe in Jesus as the Messiah. Hebrews 10:29 reminds us or warns us of how much worse punishment do you suppose will be thought worthy of that follower who has trampled the Son of God underfoot, who has gone away from following him and perhaps led others also. Therefore, he says, do not cast away your confidence in God, which has great reward, but instead hold fast to your faith. Paul says, endure hardness as a good soldier. Recognize you can trust in God, and you must trust in God. For he says there in Hebrews 10, the just shall live by their faith.